Imagine training every day, pushing yourself to be the best player, while your coach's eyes are always on you. At first, you think it's just the pressure of being watched, but over time, you start noticing something different in his gaze, in the way he approaches you, in the way his words carry an unspoken meaning. The tension builds. The line between respect and desire becomes dangerously blurred. What happens when a coach and his player cross a boundary that was never meant to be crossed? Can forbidden desire be stronger than the fear of consequences? Before we dive into this intense story, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a like so you don't miss any of the twists and turns ahead. The summer heat clung to my skin as I gripped the bat, focusing on the pitcher's movements. The sound of the ball cutting through the air, the satisfying crack of wood meeting leather. It was the rhythm of my life. Baseball was everything to me, but lately, something had shifted. I could feel his eyes on me. Even when I wasn't looking, I knew he was watching. Ryan Mitchell, my coach, my mentor, the man who had pushed me harder than anyone else. He was respected, admired, and completely untouchable. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed. It wasn't just the way he corrected my stance during practice, his hands firm on my shoulders, his breath close enough to make my skin prickle. It was in the pauses, the way his gaze lingered for a second too long, the silence between us filled with an unspoken tension neither of us dared to acknowledge. Today, as the rest of the team packed up and headed to the locker rooms, I stayed behind, perfecting my swing. At least, that was the excuse I told myself. Ryan leaned against the fence, his arms crossed over his chest, watching. "You're pushing too hard." His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something that made my pulse quicken. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, swallowing hard. "I just need to get it right." He stepped closer, his presence filling the space around me. "You already did." I turned to face him, and for the first time I didn't look away. His blue eyes locked onto mine, unreadable, searching. "Then why do you keep staring at me like that?" The words left my mouth before I could stop them. For a second, the air between us was electric. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. And then, just as quickly, he pulled away. "Hit the showers, Thompson." His voice was rough, controlled. I should have dropped it. I should have walked away. But as I stood there, watching his retreating figure, I knew. This wasn't just in my head. Something was happening between us, and I had no idea if I was ready for it. The locker room was quiet except for the faint dripping of a leaky faucet. Most of the guys had already left, their laughter and chatter fading down the hall. I should have gone too, but instead, I stood under the shower, letting the water run down my body, hoping it would drown out the thoughts racing through my mind. Ryan's eyes, the way they lingered, the way his voice changed when he spoke to me. I had always admired him. He was the kind of man everyone respected, the kind of leader who didn't just command authority, he embodied it. But lately, that admiration had turned into something else, something dangerous. I turned off the water, shaking my head. "Get it together, Jake." Wrapping a towel around my waist, I walked toward my locker. That's when I heard it. A voice. His voice. Ryan. He was outside the locker room, speaking to someone, his tone firm but quiet. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew that voice anywhere. Something in my chest tightened. Before I could even think about it, I stepped closer to the doorway. The voices stopped. A few seconds later, the door creaked open. Ryan stepped inside. His gaze landed on me immediately, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. His eyes flickered downward for a brief second, so fast I almost thought I imagined it. Almost. His jaw tensed. "You're still here." I nodded, gripping the towel around my waist a little tighter. Yeah, just taking my time. Silence. The kind that stretched too long, that made the air feel thick, heavy. Ryan exhaled and ran a hand through his hair, looking anywhere but at me. You played well today. I swallowed hard. Thanks. He hesitated, then took a step forward. Not too close, but close enough. You're improving a lot, Jake. His voice was quieter now, lower. You're one of the best players I've ever trained. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I should have looked away. I should have walked past him and left. But I didn't. Instead, I said the one thing I shouldn't have. Then why do you always look at me like you want something else? Ryan's breath hitched. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. For a second, I thought he was going to leave. But he didn't. Instead, he closed the distance. Not enough to touch me, but enough for me to feel the heat radiating from his body. Enough for me to notice the way his breathing had changed. Jake. His voice was tight, strained, a warning. I didn't move. Neither did he. It was reckless. It was wrong. But in that moment, neither of us cared. The air between us was suffocating. Neither of us moved, but everything had already shifted. I could feel the weight of his hesitation, the war going on inside his head. He should have walked away. I should have let him. But neither of us did. Ryan's eyes flickered, scanning my face like he was searching for something, a reason to stop, a reason to go further. I wasn't sure what he found. All I knew was that 1 second, he was standing still, rigid with restraint, and the next, he wasn't. His fingers brushed my arm, light, hesitant, but enough to make my breath hitch. I wasn't imagining it this time. It wasn't just in my head. He was touching me. I swallowed, my heart pounding so hard I thought he could hear it. Ryan. His name barely left my lips before he pulled back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tightened. This can't happen. It should have ended there. He should have walked out, pretended this never happened. Instead, he let out a shaky breath and ran a hand over his face, as if he was trying to erase whatever had just passed between us. I can't. He exhaled sharply. Not here. My stomach twisted. Not here. But somewhere else? I should have let him leave. I should have nodded, walked past him, ended this before it began. But instead, I did the one thing I'd regret more than anything else. I reached for him. Not much, just a hand on his wrist, barely enough to hold him there. Barely enough to stop him. It was a mistake, because the second my skin touched his, it was like something snapped inside him. His hand closed around mine, tight, desperate. His breathing turned uneven, and when he looked at me again, his resolve was crumbling before my eyes. We were playing a dangerous game, and I had just pushed him over the edge. Ryan's grip loosened, his fingers trailing over my wrist before he let go completely. His voice was hoarse when he spoke again. Not here. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my body on fire, my mind spinning with 1,000 possibilities. Not here. Then where? And how much longer before we completely lost control? I told myself I wouldn't think about it. I told myself I'd let it go. But by the time I arrived at practice the next day, my mind was still stuck in that moment, his touch, his hesitation, the way he looked at me before walking away. And I wasn't the only one thinking about it. Ryan was different. He didn't speak to me unless he had to. He barely looked at me. Every time I caught his gaze, he turned away so fast it was like I wasn't even there. It was a game of avoidance, and he was winning. But I wasn't sure how much longer either of us could keep it up. After practice, most of the guys headed out, leaving only a few stragglers finishing their routines. I stayed behind, telling myself I needed the extra reps, but really I was waiting. And then, like clockwork, he was there. Ryan stood near the dugout, arms crossed, watching from a distance. He wasn't supposed to be there anymore. His shift had ended. But he hadn't left. Neither had I. It was only a matter of time before one of us cracked. I took a deep breath and walked over, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. Are we just going to keep pretending? My voice was lower than I intended, but I didn't back down. Ryan exhaled through his nose, jaw tight. There's nothing to pretend. I huffed a bitter laugh. Right. So you're just avoiding me for no reason? Silence. The tension was unbearable. I could hear the faint chatter of the few players still around, but out here, standing in the dim light of the field, it was just us. His fingers twitched at his sides, like he wanted to move, but he forced himself to stay still. Jake, I'm your coach. His voice was barely above a whisper. You know this is wrong. I stepped closer. Then why don't you walk away? Ryan swallowed hard. His throat bobbed, his hands curling into fists. I don't know. For the first time, he admitted it. He didn't have control over this, over us, and neither did I. The space between us was closing, inch by inch. My breathing was uneven, my skin tingling with anticipation. One move, 1 second. That's all it would take. Then, suddenly, a noise, a voice calling from the distance. We snapped apart just as one of the assistant coaches stepped into view. Ryan cleared his throat, taking a step back. His face was unreadable again, his walls snapping back up. Go home, Thompson. His voice was firm, but I didn't miss the way his hands shook slightly at his sides. Now! I wanted to say something, to push just a little more, but I didn't, because I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I told myself I'd stay away. I told myself I wouldn't push him anymore, but by the time the weekend rolled around, that promise was long gone. I should have gone home after practice, should have let things cool down. But instead, I was standing outside his office, my heart pounding, my hand hovering over the door. Ryan had been avoiding me for days. He barely spoke to me during practice, barely acknowledged I existed. And yet, when the last of the team had left that evening, I'd noticed his light was still on. He was still here. And so was I. I took a deep breath and knocked. Silence. Then, come in. I hesitated for only a second before pushing the door open. Ryan was at his desk, head down, rubbing his temples like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. The only light in the room came from the lamp beside him, casting deep shadows across his face. He didn't look up. What do you need, Jake? I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. For you to stop pretending this isn't happening. That got his attention. He exhaled sharply, finally meeting my eyes. His expression was unreadable, his jaw tight. You need to leave. His voice was controlled, but his fingers tapped against the desk, a nervous habit I'd never seen before. I took another step closer. You don't mean that. Ryan pushed back from his desk, standing abruptly. This isn't a game, Jake. Then stop treating me like a kid. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't regret them. I wasn't just some naive player with a crush. I knew exactly what I was doing. Ryan's eyes darkened. His chest rose and fell in deep, measured breaths. This is wrong. Then why are you still standing here? He didn't have an answer. Neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, something neither of us wanted to name. I should have walked out. He should have told me to go. But instead, I watched as his restraint cracked, just for a second. His hand twitched at his side, his gaze flickering down to my lips before snapping away. He was fighting himself. And he was losing. I could feel my own breathing turn uneven. I wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. All I knew was that 1 second we were standing apart, and the next, his hands were gripping my shirt, pushing me back against the door. The impact sent a shiver through me. My breath hitched. Ryan hovered there, so close I could feel the warmth of him, could see the war in his expression. "Tell me to stop." His voice was hoarse, desperate. I should have. I could have. But instead I grabbed his wrist, holding him there. "Don't stop." That was all it took. His mouth crashed against mine, rough, urgent, every ounce of restraint he had shattering in an instant. This was a mistake, a huge mistake. But as I pulled him closer, as his fingers tightened against my skin, as every thought left my mind except the way he felt against me, I didn't care, not anymore. The room was spinning. I could still feel the heat of his touch, the pressure of his lips on mine. The way his fingers had gripped my waist like he was afraid to let go. But now, he was gone. Ryan had pulled away so fast it was like he'd been burned. His breathing was ragged, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wouldn't even look at me. "I can't do this." His voice was barely above a whisper. My chest tightened. "Ryan." "No." He shook his head, finally meeting my eyes, and what I saw there made my stomach drop. Regret, not hesitation, not longing, just guilt. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "You want this. I know you do." His jaw tightened. "That's the problem." For a second, neither of us spoke. The weight of his words settled between us, suffocating. I felt like a damn fool. I had let myself believe that we meant something, that it wasn't just a mistake in his eyes, but the way he was looking at me now, like he was trying to erase what had just happened. I knew I was wrong. Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You need to leave." The finality in his tone cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I hesitated for half a second, hoping, praying, that he'd change his mind, that he'd stop me. But he didn't. So I turned around and walked out. And this time, he didn't follow. For the next week, he pretended I didn't exist. Practice became unbearable. I was used to him watching me, pushing me harder than the others. But now, he barely acknowledged me. He treated me like I was just another player, like nothing had ever happened. And that hurt more than anything. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I was over it. But late at night, when I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, all I could think about was that night in his office. The way he kissed me like he needed me. And then the way he walked away. I hated him. I hated myself more. The season was ending soon. One more game. Then it would all be over. No more practices. No more late nights in the locker room. No more Ryan. And maybe that was for the best. That's what I kept telling myself. Until the night before the final game, when I walked into the empty locker room and found him there, sitting alone, head in his hands. I should have left. I should have ignored him, given him a taste of his own medicine. But instead, my feet moved forward before I could stop them. "Are you okay?" My voice was softer than I wanted it to be. Ryan looked up, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't distance. It was pain. Real, raw, undeniable pain. "I never wanted to hurt you, Jake." I exhaled shakily. "Then why did you?" He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but he just couldn't say it out loud, because we both knew the truth. This was never going to end any other way. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some loves aren't meant to survive the weight of the world, and sometimes the people who set our hearts on fire are the same ones who leave us with nothing but ashes. Jake and Ryan's story was never going to be easy. From the very beginning, they were walking a dangerous path, one paved with secrets, stolen glances, and the unbearable weight of desire that could never fully be realized. What started as admiration turned into something more, a connection neither of them expected, yet neither of them could deny. But the world isn't kind to love that exists in the shadows. Jake was young, reckless, and unafraid to chase what he wanted. He saw Ryan as more than a coach. He saw him as a man, as someone struggling with the same emotions he was too scared to name. And Ryan? He was a man torn apart by his own conscience, by the suffocating expectations of the world around him, by the knowledge that some risks come with consequences too heavy to bear. For a fleeting moment, they had something real, a kiss in the dim glow of an office lamp, a touch that spoke more than words ever could, a moment where nothing else mattered but the way they felt. And then, it was over. Because the truth is, love alone is never enough. Ryan chose his fear over his feelings. He chose to protect himself at the cost of breaking Jake's heart. And Jake, despite his anger, despite the pain of being cast aside, knew deep down that there was never going to be another outcome. Because this was never a love story. It was a collision. Two lives crashing together in a way that could never last. Jake will move on. He'll heal. He'll learn to live with the ghost of what could have been. And Ryan? He'll spend the rest of his life wondering if he made the right choice. Because some regrets never fade, and some loves never truly die. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of every stolen glance, every unspoken word, every ache of a love that was never meant to last, then you know this isn't just a story. It's a reality for so many people. How many times have you wanted something, someone, and the world told you that you couldn't have it? How many times have you loved in silence because speaking those feelings out loud felt too dangerous? Ryan and Jake's story is the story of fear and desire, of longing and loss. It's the story of every person who has ever been too afraid to love loudly. But here's what I want you to remember. You deserve to love without fear. No one should have to hide who they are. No one should have to choose between happiness and acceptance. If this story broke your heart, if it made you feel something, then do something about it. Don't let fear keep you from love. Don't let the world tell you who you're allowed to be. And most importantly, be the kind of person who makes the world safer for love like Jake and Ryan's. Now tell me in the comments, have you ever felt trapped between what you want and what you're afraid of? Do you think Ryan made the right choice? Or do you think love should always win? What would you have done if you were in Jake's shoes? If you felt every moment of this story, don't leave without hitting that like button. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional, powerful story like this one. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because love should never have to be a secret. Thank you for being here. Thank you for feeling this story. And most importantly, never be afraid to love.